Welcome to the Evolution of Aloha podcast with me, Dr. Jerry Ibalarosa Tanel. Now let's talk story. All right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a few months since we've done a podcast. In fact, the last time I did a podcast was in May. So it's such an honor to be here with you, Dr. Jones. So thank you so much for everyone that is joining us. Welcome to the Evolution of Aloha podcast, a Plowline Media production. And I am your host, Dr. Jerry Balarosa Tanel, or everybody just calls me Dr. G. So I am so honored to be here with Dr. Joan King. She is a National Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Conference presenter and consultant. Dr. Joan King has a BA in English with an emphasis in creative writing, an MA in English, and a doctorate in education. She is a published author and a former high school teacher for Washington State, and her articles regarding Asian American voices have been published in tinybeans.com, Mochi Magazine, Memoir Magazine, and Writerly Magazine. What, I had a hard time saying that. But before we get started, one of the first things I'd like to do is honor the land on which our feet stand. And I will begin by acknowledging that those of us who are gathering in the Pacific Northwest area, specifically here in the Seattle area north, we are on the ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish people who have lived in the Salish Sea Basin since time immemorial. We respect this place and honor the sacred spiritual connection to the land, water, and its people, past, present, and future. By acknowledging these lands and their original indigenous inhabitants, we reach back to our own indigeneity and reflect on the impacts of colonialism and the lands from which all our people come. We're connected to our ancestors through this connection to land, for the land is what connects us all. So please join us in taking a moment to honor the land of the traditional people in the territory in which you reside. Today, we honor the Tulalip tribes and allied bands for their enduring care and continuous protection of the land where I currently reside. So thank you, everyone, and thank you to the Tulalip tribes. So, Dr. Joan, it's been such a pleasure. We have crossed paths in many different places, and I know that you participated in our workshop at NCORE. So, and now you have a book that's going to be coming out called Kinda Korean.
That's right.
What does that mean? What does Kinda Korean mean?
Oh my gosh. So it's kind of funny. So the subtitle of my book is, so it's Kinda Korean, Stories from an American Life. And the subtitle to me was a little bit of the middle finger because that, to me, it was almost like a little indicator of like protest. Like, I am American and these are American stories, right? Because I've spent so much of my life being othered or being told that I was effectively white or that I didn't experience racism or discrimination because I was perceived as effectively white. And, you know, a lot of that comes from folks who are real uneducated about colorism and real uneducated on really what race means. And I wrote the story to really be the first, or not the first, but I kind of wanted to get my book in the laps of like other Asian American women, specifically East Asian women, because there is so much like silence and so much like of what we experience, which is like disproportionate sexual assault and even experiencing misogyny in very different ways. Like, I think they're, you know, as, you know, speaking from my community, a lot of folks don't really like lean into understanding what it really means to be an Asian woman in this country, what it means to have an intersectional identity. So for me, it was like coming from a place of love, for Asian women to say, I'll go first here and rip the scab off of my wounds and really just, not to sound like, but I mean, I am like, I am an artist, so it sounds very like artsy, but like to bleed for these women. So I'll go first, and then hopefully that'll encourage other women to come forward with their experiences. I dedicated it to Asian women, but at the same time, what it was cathartic because I needed to heal from a lot of trauma that was inflicted by my tiger mom. So it was really going through the process and then revisiting a lot of trauma that even I had kind of like packaged up and buried.
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
So going back and then untying that, I mean, it's like in breathing into it, right? It's like that can be it can be scary, it can be uncomfortable, but it's so needed. I know that for a lot of people, we have this trauma that has been buried so deep, but it manifests itself within us in certain kind of way, and we don't even know what it is, right? Our ability to, and I'm just speaking for myself, right? The ability to just snap back like really
Yeah.
quickly, right? Without even thinking about anything. And it's like, where did that come from? Right.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like going back and revisiting those wounds that can be pretty much a print on our DNA.
Yes, I actually, it's funny you said that because I've been really leaning into this idea of what's it called? Genetic memory. So
Mhm.
Stephanie Fu wrote about it, and the second I read about what it meant, which is like this idea that what your ancestors went through, that trauma, it gives a whole new lens to intergenerational trauma. It means that we were all changed on a molecular level. And
Right.
our DNA, our chain, our our future kinfolk will never be the same because of that trauma, right? And when I started leaning into that, I was like, oh, this is why I am the way I am. And for those of you who aren't aware, Dr. Jerry and I met at a conference, and she was talking wisdom, essentially, just like the need to go back into your history to really understand your present self. And it was really funny because it was during a time when I had like already gone through the research, and I was like in my moment of healing, and it kind of like drew an underscore under what I was experiencing. And for Koreans, especially, for my ancestors, they went through colonization. The Japanese came, colonized Korea, and my dad was actually taken to be a laborer in Japan. So my dad's family. So he was actually born in Japan. So he speaks Japanese, but has Korean blood, but then ended up moving back to Korea. So he too experienced this like, what am I, right? Yeah. So that's kind of like also what kind of Korean means. It's like this questioning of yourself. And even if without the irritating way in which folks question who we are from like an exterior perspective, that question is still inherently there, right?
Mhm.
Because we are always in a place of I think from the day we're born trying to figure out our placement in this universe. Yeah.
Right, right. And it's so, it's so fascinating, right? The generational trauma, the things that makes us us.
Mhm.
And when we're not able to actually breathe life into it, right? That breath of life, so then that way it could have that healing.
Mhm.
It festers. It
Oh yeah.
festers.
Oh my gosh, yes. Yeah.
So yeah.
A lot of folks, when I was done with the book, my beta readers were like, oh, that must have been really cathartic for you to like revisit your trauma. And I have to say it was, but it was so much more than I had anticipated, because what's real interesting is when you are forced to revisit your trauma, you have you have new knowledge, right? So you're looking at it from this other lens, but
Mhm,
you're like kind of
mhm.
pulling it off a shelf and then you're like reassessing it, something that you haven't looked at for years. And you're looking at it as an adult with your new eyes and your new wisdom, and it means something totally different. It's
Right.
like, right? Like it's just the limit of the limitations of your understanding. And then looking at it again, it means there are just so many things that click into place. Um, but I wrote the thing and I felt like that story was just weighing on my heart like my whole life. And I got it off my chest. And it felt so relieving. And then what I didn't expect was I was really hit with a wall of rage. Like I had, it wasn't the writing that healed me. It was, it was, but the healing could not begin until I wrote it. So
Absolutely.
yeah, so I was just feeling so heavy and angry, and it was just infiltrating like every part of my life. I have an 11-year-old son, and I couldn't even look at him clearly. I could only just like sit in this like cloud of rage. Um, and then that went on for like almost a year. And I finally went into intense therapy, and then really started doing the research to look into where my people came from and what they experienced. And I'll admit, I also saw an oracle and my like this oracle and like and I because I wanted to know about my ancestors, and this might be funny for some viewers out there, but the last person I could really ask were my parents. um
Hmm.
sadly.
Hmm.
But I think that's a lot of like immigrant families, that's a lot of the experience, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. You can't, and we can't heal what is not acknowledged.
Hmm.
So you acknowledging the fact that, as you were going into it, you felt this sense of rage. Pokalai Inui talks about these 5 phases of decolonization. And so the first phase is rediscover and recover, right? And so digging into it, going back into our ancestry, figuring out what happened to your people. And, it's like coming back and it's like, oh my gosh, based off of all of this, I'm here. Have they healed? Have
Mm.
they healed? Have they gone through it? Oh my gosh, this is why I'm holding all of this. So after the rediscovery and recovery, there's a stage of mourning. And
Oh,
that,
okay. Sounds familiar.
yes, there's a stage of mourning where we realize that, oh, this is what has happened to my people. This is why my mom was the way she was and my grandmother the way that she was. So we can find this place as we are mourning this, we can find this place of grace and compassion and empathy and forgiveness, that even though maybe our ancestors weren't able to have that forgiveness, we can do that. So it sets the trajectory for healing 7 generations behind of us and forward, right? So then there's the mourning. After the mourning, there's the dreaming, that we start dreaming about it, like, okay, wow, what would it be like if we can't go back and change things, but I can do something now to ensure that it doesn't happen again. So how can we co-dream with other individuals on creating a world that there's not suffering, and that where healing is something that we all do and it becomes part of the norm? And then from healing, you have commitment to that dream, and then the action, that we take action. And so it's, we that those are the 5 phases of decolonization. And it's like as you were speaking about that, I started to think about the generational trauma that I hold on to as well too. And also finding that reasons on sometimes when I go back and I want to ask questions, I'm always being stopped, like, don't be digging, don't be lifting up that rock. You might find something that you don't like. Or why are you living in the past? Just let that go, right?
Hmm.
Let that go. Just let it die. Some things are just better left unsaid. And I'm like thinking, wow, what kind of trauma does that person is holding on to?
Yeah.
Have you experienced anything like that?
Oh my gosh. Well, it's funny you say that. So I want to say two things about that. Um, so I recently met an author, a fellow author, a very successful author, and someone from my community, identified as East Asian, and they asked me, "How do you feel about your book coming out?" And I said, "I want to crawl under a rock a little bit." It's a little bit of like, I feel almost kind of like hungover, like regretful that I was that honest. Because there's a lot of shame, right? There's a lot of
Mhm.
shame in being honest and coming clean.
Mhm.
And even though it's not even yours to bear, it's almost like intergenerational shame, really.
Yes.
And I told him, I was like, I was completely honest, and I know, like, I feel like crawling under a rock, but do I regret it? Absolutely not. I think it's necessary. And like I said, the reason why I wrote it was to encourage more women to be open about their traumas. Um, and they said the most interesting thing, which was, well, you were that honest? That's not necessary. And I was like, what do you mean that's not necessary? Like the the purpose in which I kept going was for others. It wasn't selfish. And I think maybe if it was a selfish endeavor, I could maybe understand why it wasn't necessary. But the way I look at it, it was life or death for me to be this honest. For me to hopefully liberate someone else from their own traumas. And
Mhm.
when he said that, he was like, it's not necessary to be that honest. It's not necessary to paint people like villains. And it was really interesting because I sat on that for months. And this idea of like feeling like you have to protect people who have done you wrong, right? It's not necessary to paint people like villains. No, not if, that's not why you do it, but if you're doing it for the greater good of other people to come forward with their honesty and their truths, then I think that's a different question, right? So there's that. So I've been, sitting with that for a while. But I continue to land on the same thing, which is it was necessary for me to turn over those rocks. Some
Mhm.
folks, like, they might be in more precarious situations where it might result in unnecessary harm. um I would say, like, that's not really the case here, with my truth. And the other thing that you said that really resonated with me was this idea of mourning. And I think what's so interesting is, like, when I went back to look at my history, the reason why I felt such relief was because I recognized that the very traumas and the rage that I was holding wasn't mine. It was passed on. And I think that also provided such liberation for me, because I think when you are inherently born with something and you don't understand it, you do kind of default to blaming yourself. And I think I had spent
Mhm.
my whole life blaming myself for something that just didn't even belong to me. And through that, I also was able to, like you said, forgive my mother, because I was like, that even wasn't your trauma,
Mhm.
right?
Yep. Yep. Yeah, exactly. And and sometimes when we go back and we explore and we investigate and then we recover or rediscover on things that was done, it's like kind of like looking at it from a distance. I know that when I was doing my research, I found some things and of things that was done in my family where again it could be that shame, like, oh gosh, I don't want anybody to think about my family that way or whatever it is. And then I had to like pause in that moment, right? Pause in that moment and think about what were their lives like at that time? Why did they do the things that they did? Why did they make the choices that they made? Did they know the consequences of this? Did they know that this was going to result into something else? But what I found is it's survival. It's
Mhm.
survival. A lot of times things that was done that we may not approve of today is survival. And when we can see that, then we can find probably a little bit more grace and understanding and not be so angry about it, right? Because I that anger, it's for real. And
Yeah.
then when we also see some of the injustices that continue to perpetuate whatever narratives and whatever things have done in the past, and we see it today, that can even make us more angry because it becomes real.
Mhm.
And it also affects, if it's affecting us, it's going to affect our children, right? Our grandchildren. And it's like we don't want to have a world like that. And so trauma is something that I feel if we um learn how to love and aloha ourselves first, then we're not going to pass that trauma on to the next generation. But you know, we do that whole part of honesty, right? It's like, oh, is this going to be calling people out? Is this going to elicit unhealed, open up unhealed wounds? And how am I going to hold space for that to happen? Right? It's like, because we don't know, we're connected to many other individuals to our
Right.
story. And so talking about our story can open up wounds that people were not ready to. And so it's like, how do you hold that space for individuals, knowing that some of the words that you share in your book may foster some other things with other people?
Yeah. Well, I think like the first person who comes to mind is my mother. Because the whole book, so the way it was designed is, so I essentially assigned concepts or like racial theories to my experiences. So there's one on the model minority myth. There's one on, I'm trying to think, colorism and so on and so forth. Um, just to give people context for
Mhm.
what it actually looks like in someone's daily life. So there's that, but so it's informative and it's very, obviously like personal because it's a narrative. So it illustrates these things and it's not an academic in an academic way, which I think a lot of these new concepts, or not new, but newer concepts, are delivered and people have a hard time digesting them. So I wanted to just paint the picture to get people to understand. And however, the central storyline is the relationship between my mother and me. And I wrote the book first, didn't tell her because I needed to just like vomit. I needed to like it out without
Yes.
thinking about consequences. So I
Yes.
painted my mom in the most accurate way possible, and it's not pretty.
Mhm.
And what's interesting is I think it's been like over a course of, my son is 11 and those first few years were so tumultuous. But I started kind of hinting like, do you know you were like this as a mother? And then I just stopped because she was so defensive. And when I started my healing process, I think what happened was she started sensing my heart changing and she started picking up inadvertently on my openness. I didn't facilitate nothing. And she started making these comments. Like in my book, I write this time where we're sitting by my family's fake Christmas tree. And she says, I'm really sorry that we didn't have the money to buy a Christmas tree growing up. We had no lights, no tree. And I had my first Christmas tree when I was, I think, 23 years old. And because we were poor. And she apologized to me, and I said, "Oh, I thought you were going to apologize for being a tough mom." And she was like, "What do you mean?" And I was like, "Don't you remember?" And I have an older brother who she has a soft spot for. And I was like, I don't know. I knew that that would be the weak point for her. So I said, "Don't you remember like him begging you not to hit him? And you just like started ramming on him with your fists." And she went quiet, and she said in Korean, "Stop." Um, the direct translation, some people would say like the translation would be, "You're going to make me cry." But the literal translation of what she said is, "Tears are coming." So what she was really expressing was the rise of emotion. And I was like, "Oh, that's guilt." Like I recognized it in that moment. And I was like, "You feel guilty. You feel guilt." That was several years ago. And then after therapy, I think she was kind of like melting, right? And after therapy, she started making these comments like watching me with my son and saying, "Wow, like you're such a good mother." And I was like, "Okay, thanks, mom." All right. But I didn't really know what was going on internally with her. And last year, or actually, I think it was earlier this year, I was tying my shoes by the front door, and she was going to stay at home with my son. And she says, "I wish you were a little girl again." And I was like, "Oh, you say that all the time." And she said, "I wish you were a little girl again so I could start over, because I think I would do better if I was given a second chance." And that, for someone like my mother, is the wildest thing to admit. Like, I genuinely would have thought hell would freeze over first before she admitted something like that. And then we started having more open conversations. And I'd be like, "Mom, do you remember this? Do you remember doing this? That's the impact you had on me." Because when I was younger, I would say, "Do you love me?" And, you see the sitcom White Families, they're always so like verbal with their love. "I love you so much. You're so perfect. You're such a good student." And I was like, "Why can't I have that white family?" And my mom, right? It's food. Did you eat? Did you eat? Like
Mhm,
eat more.
mhm.
That's love. But I just didn't know it because I was born here and too
Right.
westernized at that point to recognize it. And that's also on me. And reconciling that and taking accountability for that. And she yeah, so recently, I think again it was like earlier this year, out of nowhere she goes, "Do you love me?" And it was like the tables had turned, like she was now the child. And some viewers might be like, "Oh," but the way she answered when I would ask her that as a young girl, she would go, "Stupid question." And she wouldn't answer. It was more like, can you not see how much I love you?" So she asked me as, 60 something year old woman, I'm like 68-year-old woman, "Do you love me?" And I said, "Stupid question." And she busted up laughing because she remembered.
Mhm.
And now, like after that, she started like showering me with "I love yous" when she'd leave my house. And my inner child was like screaming. It was like, I want this so bad." But I think my adult guardian self was trying to protect her and saying like, "Shh, calm down. No,
Mhm.
no, no, no. We got to keep the guard up, right?"
Right.
So my mother every day would say, "I love you so much," and go, "Okay." And it came to the point where I was like, "This is actually forgiveness." I just didn't recognize it. I was like, "She's asking for forgiveness." So I don't know about you, but it's real common in immigrant families. We do a side hug. Even with your own children, you do a side hug. "Okay, okay, okay. Side hug, little pat." And one day she was leaving my house, and I go, "Oma, come here." And she was like, "What?" And I was like, "Come here." And I just gave her like a squish hug. I full on embraced her and I held her so tight. And that was the moment. It was just forgotten. Like we were good.
That is so beautiful. I mean, just listening to your story, that there are so many different ways to understand what love is.
Mhm.
And, it's like there's different ways of showing love and understanding love, and then also forgiveness, that the words may not come out to be where, it's like, I forgive you. It's more, I love you, or however it is, right? So there's all these different ways. And so language and everything and communication, it's so nuanced that
Yeah.
just because it is, you see it one way, that doesn't mean that it's going to be the same way for
Mm.
other people. So that multiple ways of understanding and knowing the world is, I mean, I think that's something that we should be a little bit more aware of, right? It's like seeing that white family on television, right? It's like, oh, that typical mom and dad and children, and everybody sit together at the table, and, they are like, good night, and I love you, and all these things. That's not how it was, right? In my house, we had like newspapers on the floor, and the kids were eating on the floor, and the parents were this way. But, one of the things was that we would always ensure that it was the babies and the elders that ate first,
Mhm.
right? That's the way it was. And then everybody went into their own way, but we were still a very close family. So yeah, I think with us here in the United States, for a long time, it's been modeled on what is that perfect family, what is that relationship between a mother and a daughter. We don't talk about the nuance of all of those different relationships. I know my mom has passed, and I wish I had the opportunity to have had these open conversations, with her. And being living here in the States and her in Hawaii, we would talk on the phone, but we never did have these face-to-face conversations. My opportunity to just hug my mom and tell her how much I love her, which I wish I could do. But I remember one point where my mom, the first time she came here to the United States, she was like 65 years old, right? Maybe 65, 66 years old when she first left Hawaii to come here to the continent. And, it's like she thought that we were wasting energy at SeaTac, in the SeaTac parking lot, because when she walked in, she felt the cold air, and she was like, what's happening here? Because she thought the air conditioning was on in the parking lot because it was cold to her. And at first I was like, whoa, what's up, mom? Are you all right? You're only 65 years old. Do I need to call my siblings? What's going on? And then I realized that the only time that my mom felt that cool air was in front of an air conditioner. So that was what, that started to have me think about, like, whoa, the experience that my mom had growing up is so different from someone who grew up here on the continent. And my mom and dad, they were married, gosh, 50 something years. Well, my dad passed away when he was 55. And so if they were still alive, it would be a very long time that they've been married. And when my dad passed away, my mom, she never remarried. She never remarried because to her it was, he's my only love. He will always be my only love. And I don't need to be with anybody else. And so when she passed, for us, we knew that they were together, right? We were together. But when she came here, I was going through some life changes that she didn't really understand, right? It's like I was going through a divorce, and to her, it was like, you're supposed to stay married no
Yeah.
matter what. You're supposed to stay married. You're supposed to stay married for the kids. It's like you need to, you guys build a house together. You guys should stay there. And I was like, yo, you don't even know what I'm going through. But then I had to stop and think about, what did my mom go through? what did my mom and dad go through, right? I mean, it's like I remember them always being loving and everything like that, but I had to think about, where did she get that idea that no matter what is happening in your life, you have to stay married? I'm like, whoa, that's, that's something different. But I get it, right? I get it. That's again survival, you
Yeah.
know, survival.
Yeah, understanding their frame of reference, like
Mm,
also I think really for immigrant families as well, it's also really interesting. I mean, I think there's a comedian who spoke about this. He is South Asian, and he talks about how his when they immigrated here together, his dad, saw the effects of like first-handedly a war-torn country, poverty, and then coming here, and then what was happening after 9/11, people thinking that he was a terrorist. And when his son, the comedian, would complain about things like microaggressions, his father was unsympathetic because he was like, what are you complaining about? Like, do you know what I survived? And it's like a disconnect, and it's not the father's fault, it's not the son's fault, it's just a divide, right? And it took me until my 30s really to understand why my mother didn't seem so present, or why she didn't understand my teenage years. Because when she was a teenager, she was experiencing a war-torn country. My mother's technically North Korean, and her grandmother escaped with her and the second to youngest daughter on foot. And she left her other daughters in North Korea because her logic was, I have to escape now. The eldest children have a higher chance of survival if they're left alone. So she took the two youngest, my mother on her back, holding the hand of her sister, and she escaped North Korea that way. And so it really, I don't want to diminish my experiences, but at the same time, I don't know how I cannot. But it's incomparable. Like, really stopping to think about what she went through. What I went through, what I thought were challenges in my teenage years were insignificant.
right.
And it's empathy. It's forcing yourself to put your shoes behind, really.
Mm.
Um, and it's really, it's challenging to do as a teenager. But that generational divide, my mother was like oceans away. We could not understand each other. Yeah.
That makes me think about, I want to go a little bit deeper and kind of hear what your, just your definition of what does it mean to be a model minority?
Oh yeah. Yeah, so the model minority myth started really, so it really goes back to the Chinese Exclusion Act. So it was the first bill, the legislation of its kind, to restrict those immigrating to the States based on ethnic origin. And so it came from Yellow Peril, thinking that Chinese immigrants were stealing jobs, taking jobs away from white people. So they put the Chinese Exclusion Act into effect. And when it was lifted, what the US did was they picked the cream of the crop. They allowed in only select Asian immigrants. And the Chinese Exclusion Act affected all Asian Americans. It wasn't just the Chinese. So when they lifted the act, they picked wealthy, affluent, successful, educated Asian Americans and let them through. And what white folks did, is they took this new wave of Asian American immigrants, and they used it to pit Asians and Blacks against one another. And it was really used as a tool to keep Black Americans down, because the rhetoric was, don't you see how well these these minorities are doing? Don't you see how well these immigrants are doing? Black communities, why can't you perform as high as they can, right? Ignoring the fact that they weren't immigrants in the first place, had zero government supports, ignoring the fact that, after the Emancipation Proclamation, and more accurately Juneteenth, they were literally just dropped on their behinds to figure it out for themselves. And there was this interview that was done that always stayed with me. I know people reference like I Have a Dream and all the other prevalent MLK Jr. quotes, but the one quote that really stayed with me was how Martin Luther King Jr. said, "We were told to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, but how can you do that with no boots?" Right? So you are telling me like the most like egregious thing you could do to Black Americans, but okay, sure, you're going to let in this wave of like high performing East Asians, but majority East Asians, and say like, can't you be like them? And really the long lasting effects of that today would not only be the remnant internalized pitting against one another, because I have to say, truthfully, there are a lot of Asian American folks who bought into that. And, those from the Black community who also bought into that. And it was, it's a very common trope. We saw it in Spike Lee movies, right? With like the Korean convenience store owners and Black teenagers walking into the store and the automatic suspicion of one another. So yeah, I mean, there is truth to it as well, because people bought into it. But the model minority myth also does a disservice because it erases a lot of the underrepresented narratives, the low income Asian Americans, the Asian Americans who are not college educated, didn't even finish high school, the ones who are gang affiliated, the ones who are refugees, are actually didn't immigrate here legally, so on and so forth. And one of the prevalent, I would say, side effects of the model minority myth is the fact that because there's this perception that we're so affluent and high performing, we're not offered resources that we need. So, Asian American is like this huge term, so inaccurate. I'm not a fan. But we're talking about 50 ethnic groups. Same with like Pacific Islander, right? So there's so many different islands, such diversity in foods, cultures, dance, songs, stories, folklore. We were shoved into one term, but like folks don't think that like Indians are Asian. Folks forget that some people from Russia are Asian. Iraqis are Asian, and people forget because they think when, what comes to mind is just like Chinese or Japanese.
Mhm.
And all of these other stories are just erased. And, Crazy Rich Asians, it was first a book, then made into a movie, I think is a really great example of how, people go, oh yeah, that's right. That's what Asian Americans are like. And it's like, what about the immigrant experience? Or, I grew up poor, but at the same time, though, I am light-skinned. So I've had immense privileges in my life as well. Immense privileges. So really speaking to like the work I do, I want people to think about Asian American being so interconnected with colorism. So with all the different countries, you have to think about like a spectrum. So like myself being East Asian and fair-skinned, I have so many privileges compared to, my other siblings, cousins who are, are more rich in their melanin. So it's a mess. The whole conversation is a mess and people are so uneducated about it.
Right, right. And I think that's where we need to be able to have the tools to be able to engage in these conversations. And it's so hard because people have one way of thinking, and this is what we've been fed for such a long time that nobody's questioning the things that we've been fed. They're just like, this is the truth. So when people look at me, they're like, oh, Polynesian Pacific Islander. but it's like, oh my gosh, I'm so more than that, right? It's like when people see someone like you, they'll be like, probably Chinese.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because that's what they have. Yeah.
Exactly. And like, they're not wrong to assume some privileges that I have, right? Like they look at me and because, fair-skinned East Asian woman, they're like, oh, college educated.
Mhm.
Yes. And because two things can be possible at the same time, the beauty of multiple truths. But the idea that I achieved higher ed easily, right? I was low income. I don't know. I don't think this was even in my bio, but I'm a veteran, or maybe it was. I served in the United States Air Force, and my military service allowed me to gain higher education. I did have a bachelor's before I joined, but like, oh my God, we nearly went broke trying to get me into college because for my immigrant parents, they were like, go broke or go home. We have to, like, it's the coveted American education. It's the reason why they immigrated here to make sure that their children had an American education, American diploma. So yes, and right, like, yes, absolutely. Being college educated is a privilege. But our systems are so broken and so inequitable for minoritized populations. But yeah, with the model minority myth, it just completely overrides all of that.
And all the stereotypes that go with it and how people play into those stereotypes and everything like that. Yeah, it's like you just talked about how the system is broken, but we know there's some of us out there that believe that the system is doing exactly what the system it was built to do.
Yeah, keep
And
out.
yeah, exactly. Exactly. And so, it's like having the conversation, because right now in our country, diversity, equity, inclusion is like a taboo thing, right? Everywhere, right? Higher ed is being just cut. Everything is being cut around DEI and not understanding the depth of what DEI is all about. People think that, it's like what they call Kamala Harris, a DEI hire. So, just out of your expertise, what is DEI all about?
Oh my gosh, that's the $1 million question, right? What I like to say is if people really understood what DEI was, they would understand that we're all for it. Like if even those super, like uneducated, um, uneducated folks who are so anti-DEI, if they really understood what it was, they would be for it. Um, because it is impossible to live in this world and not have someone in your family or your inner circle who is in need of the removal of a barrier in our system. It's
Exactly.
not possible. Um,
Exactly.
so right, and for me, it's I really grapple with the terms because the terms have been so, for lack of a better word, tainted. I'm gonna out myself here. I market myself as a cultural competency trainer now because that's more digestible and people are way more open.
Talk about that. Say a little bit more. What does that mean? What does that mean?
So when I talk about cultural competency, I do a lot of work where people begin with themselves first. So my whole thing, the theory that I work with is, and this is not mine. Laura Pinto wrote a lot about it back in the day. But cultural competency is a term used in a lot of like teacher preparatory programs, where it's this idea that like a teacher steps into a classroom and they can only look at their students through their own lens, right? So the theory is you actually can never fully understand your students until you understand your lens first. So in my recent courses, I have folks, educators, stop and do their cultural tree. And I have them talk to family members and people from their community you're not going to be surprised, but a lot of white educators, you know, struggle with this because they're like, I don't have a culture, or my culture is boring. And I'm like, the only reason why you think that you have no culture is because your people have been told that being white was good enough. Like, you weren't forced to actually look. You weren't forced to think about it because your lens is the default in this country. So like, that's like asking a fish to stop and think about what the water is, right? When like
Right,
you've
right,
been living in it the whole life and people are catering to you, why would you think about it? So
absolutely.
yeah, so having to unpack that, and it's so it's fascinating and frustrating at the same time. Because when you actually ask the questions like, okay, how do you conflict resolve in your family? And they can explain that, oh, we sweep things under the rug. You take it directly to the person. And I'm like, that's culture. Is your family a matriarchy? Is it a
Hmm.
patriarchy? That's culture.
Hmm.
The games that you grew up with, the dances that you dance, like that's culture. And like, you know, there are very elementary ways to think about it, like the flag of your of your ethnic group, so on and so forth. But the little like micro ways in that you communicate your culture. Like, how do you expect students to respect you in the classroom? That's culture. That is a cultural reference, right? How do you perceive a well-behaved student? That speaks to your culture, but they've never been forced to stop and think. Um, because here's the thing, if you are identifying a student as disruptive, you cannot you cannot accurately see that student, right? Because you are defining them as disruptive based on your cultural lens. You have to do that work first. So after
Yes.
that work is complete, then you can stop and see, okay, what cultural background does that student have? Do they belong to a culture where being vocal, being
Hmm.
like
Hmm.
popcorning instead of raising your hand is actually a way to engage and show attentiveness in class? Then now you understand that they're actually not being disruptive, they're engaged, right?
Right,
Yeah.
right. Yes.
That also goes into that idea, because I don't think you can talk about cultural competency without talking about Black joy. Like, how many, like the biases, the implicit biases that like Black students are so disruptive. But really, it's like that idea of just like verbalizing joy. And you know, I don't even know if you can talk about it without going back to ancestry of having to behave a certain way, be quiet, like being loud and being able to verbalize and be able to not like sit down and shut up in the class space. It's their way of engaging with the world, right? For some of our Black students. And why is that so easily rejected? It's because folks just don't understand how to switch between lenses. And like,
Mhm.
honestly, if we're gonna tie it back, like that's how I was able to heal with my mother, is because I put my lens down and put her lens on. And
Yes.
it was okay
Yes.
from her reference point, she was actually doing her best to be a good mom. So it's like, it's
Absolutely.
right, it's empathy work. It's really, it's like, it's research. We have to like research one another.
Right, right. And get to know, like, I love the fact that you brought it to, it's like you've got to do the inner work before you do the outer work, right?
Yeah.
It's like one of my favorite philosophers, Krishnamurti, he says that the only hope for humankind is in the transformation of the individual, which means that we do need to transform and we do need to be able to look at our cultural lens. We're talking about the classroom and meeting the students. It's like there's students out there that we understand that the learning doesn't happen in the classroom. The learning happens outside of the classroom. We also can learn from the environment, that our environment, our entire environment, inside and outside, is our classroom, because a classroom is a place of learning. And learning doesn't only happen in a classroom with a sage on a stage, right? All of our students that come into the classroom carry their own wisdom. And can you imagine if, we would look at that as a way of reciprocity, that you teach me something, I teach you something, and how we can grow together. And it is amazing when, we're talking about, DEI. This is DEI work, just what you and I are talking about. Being able to fully show up in a space and not be worried about being deemed too loud or disruptive, which means that we need to suppress who we are as individuals, and I know that a lot of people who don't really understand the importance of DEI. Some of them feel like, well, one side wants to just remove all of the Christian ways, and and deem God as something that is not welcome. That's not what we're doing. What we want to do is, like, can we just have people love their God the way that they do?
Yeah.
If it's like there's a lot of different cultures that have a pantheon of gods. Does that make them any less than just one single God? Right. So there's that conversation that comes in. It's like I think the other one that's really big is like, you want to take away my gun rights. No, it's just about having the laws to protect each other and ensuring that, we need to be a little bit more strict on it. So I think it's just about, recognizing that we are interconnected as one community. And I think it's so important that we see each other where we can align with one another. We can foster a culture where individuals can uplift one another, right? Embodying that spirit of what is it? Neighbor helping neighbor.
And with the gun debate, and also the DEI debate as well, I always get questions, like, so when I did most recently a cultural competency workshop, there was this question of like, well, if we tailor our classes to students of color, what about the white students? And that it comes up all the time, right? And which is so interesting because like the whole point was to amplify students of color. So I'm like, what then we'd be right back to where we started. Or even the whole like gun rights debate, it all ties to this idea that if we give something to someone, then someone gets something taken away. And that is a total BS idea. It's a fallacy. It's a fallacy, and that concept doesn't actually exist when we unpack it. Because even folks, even like the thing that I never understand is folks who preach Dr. MLK Jr.'s words, but they're anti-DEI, right? And I'm like, that actually cannot, I just don't think that can coexist. If you're for his work, then you're for DEI. Like it doesn't exist without the other. And what Dr. MLK Jr. always preached about was love, right? And I always break it down to like, why are we talking about something getting taken away from someone else? Like when we go back to love, all right? If you ever, and I don't have a second child, I'm a one and done mom, but like if you had a second child, are you concerned that you will run out of love for your second?
Right. Right.
Yes, there's no what pool of justice are you looking at where there's like a finite amount of justice? This is not like a jar of candy. It's not, you know what I mean? That like we're talking about something that it's infinite. Justice is infinite. So this idea that if we do this for our students of color, we are taking away from white students. If we have gun laws, we're taking away from gun owners. Like it doesn't, that polarized opinion, it's no. Like this idea of safety, if we are making things safe for students in school, it doesn't mean we're taking something away from another group. It's just not this whole idea of like one or the other. I honestly, I genuinely, well, I know where it came from. I think it's white supremacy working in the way that it works, right? It's spinning these fallacies, and people drink that Kool-Aid so that they could keep the status quo. But for those of us who have done, some of the work, there's still so much work to be done on my part as well. But for some of us who've actually started our journey in educating ourselves, we're looking at these arguments and they're like totally nonsensical. People are thinking it's like pie or pizza, like,
Right,
but
right.
what about mine?
Exactly, exactly. And that's where my whole concept of aloha comes in, right? It's that love, it's that compassion, it's that grace for everyone. It's for everyone. And so, it's like I always look at three different concepts when it comes to a foundation, when it comes to aloha. So aloha akua is love and connection to the divine. Aloha Aina, which is love and connection to the land, and then Aloha Kanaka, which is love and connection to the fellow human beings. We can't have one without the other. We can't have one without the other. And, I feel that with the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion, we need to be able to see that, yeah, we're not trying to take away one from the other. And I think it can get so complex and we can go down into the rabbit hole, especially when it comes to inclusivity, right? When we talk about inclusion, it's like, all right, what does inclusion mean? And does inclusion mean that we're only going to be including individuals that think the same way as us, as they look like us, they believe the same thing, they're on our agenda, because that's what everybody thinks is DEI is an agenda. How do we include individuals who feel excluded from the conversation? And how do we get them to start talking to each other, to start seeing things? How do you work towards shifting paradigms with individuals?
I think that when it comes to inclusion, I don't know if you can achieve inclusion without empowerment. Um, I think with communities of color, specifically women, there is this like humbleness, but not in a good way. It's like, what? No, I'm undeserving. I'm nothing, right? And if you look historically at intergenerational trauma or historical traumas, it makes a lot of sense, right? Because they were told, they were honestly like, especially women of color, they were the foundations for families surviving. But at the same time, like they had to do that while keeping their heads down. They had to take the brunt of things like they had to take accountability for things that like weren't even their own, right? And if you even look at like Black women, in order to protect their children, they had to take the brunt, the accountability for things that were not their own. And that I feel has been passed on to our generations now. And you see that in career spaces, in professional spaces, you see women thinking like, oh, I don't know much about this, because we have politicized so many of these terms. People think I don't have a formal education in DEI. I don't have the knowledge on like the new research. And I'm like, no, it doesn't. This is part of the issue, is that I've even seen it on job applications now in DEI spaces, where they ask like, are you up to date on current research for DEI? And I'm like, don't you know that's a barrier for a lot of people who are just like so rich with this knowledge? And I think it's BS. Like, we need to embrace like holistic knowledge. We need people to actually trust the knowledge that has been passed down from their ancestors, instead of looking to formal academia, because who is in academia? It's the majority is white cisgendered men. So
Mhm.
like if we're constantly looking at that as the pinnacle of being well informed, we're constantly gonna feel ourselves on the out. So I think it really takes like one woman to another, honestly, or one person to another, to say, no, it is you, like you are that person. And
Mhm.
without, getting into like examples, the number of times that I have tried to bring someone in and they were like, me? Like you saw that in me? And that's a problem, right? It's a problem that they were conditioned to think that way.
Yes.
Yeah, inclusion, I just don't think can happen without empowerment. And I think that's the work we do with our communities, to tap in folks from our own communities and say like, not just saying like you are enough, because I also think like we are all enough, but to say like you are actually more, you're more than enough. And
Mhm.
to say that like your lived experience is enough, your ancestral knowledge is enough. Just because you didn't read it in a book, no, like what you know is enough.
Yes. Yeah. That internalized
Yeah.
narrative that goes on, it's like I remember I still struggle with it. I still struggle with it. And it's like getting my doctorate, it took a bit. It took a bit to be acknowledged as Dr. G, right? It's like, oh, just kind of like put that on a DL, right? It's like it's just this internalized inferiority that happens, especially for women of color, because you're right. We were told that you should be quiet. You should keep your head down. You need to work hard, but don't say anything. Don't speak up. Don't do any of this stuff. Growing up, when I was in high school, I was the one that was always up in everybody's business, right? It's like, you ain't going to tell me what to do. You're not going to tell me what to do. Now, this is in Hawaii. And it's like I was always fighting. I was always doing these things. And for some time in my life, in my 20s, maybe my early 30s, I lost that part of myself and I was conditioned to be lesser than, especially when I'm in an organization where white women who have the same degrees as me will get promoted and looked at because I speak differently. I look differently. I was told I was working for an anti-bullying organization in Seattle. I was a sales manager and I was selling anti-bullying programs to K-12. And I had the West Coast. So Hawaii was one of my areas. And I was talking to a principal at one of the schools in Hawaii, and we started to speak in our language. My boss, who was a white woman, heard me, yelled for me to get into her office after I got off the call. And she told me, I don't know who you were talking to, but you sounded pretty ignorant. And for you to be working on a master's degree, the way you spoke sounded like you couldn't even have a degree higher than junior college, as if there's something wrong with junior college. But at that point, I was like, maybe I should change then. Maybe I shouldn't be speaking this language. Maybe, and all of this stuff, to where the point where my husband and I, when we got married and my sisters came to the wedding, I told my sisters, shh, don't talk like that. I don't want my new friends to think that we're ignorant. What? What is that? What is that? Where did that come from? And how many of us are out there that don't have the relationships or the ideas that these internalized narratives is forced upon us to think of ourselves as lesser than. So you talking about, bringing in, women and letting them know that you are more than enough, that is so important. And that's, it's like, that's where I'm at, and I'm trying to get even better at it. But I see myself. I don't that girl from Hawaii that was always loud and was always fighting and was always doing these things. I do that now, but I don't do it to where I actually, punching somebody out. I've grown, matured, and I can, navigate spaces with grace. I tell people I still can find myself angry because of the injustices that many of us face. but I can also meet people with grace because there are individuals that don't even know what they're doing, right? So I just call it gracious anger, where where I'm still pissed off, I'm still angry, but I can do it with a lot of grace because we need to, right? Especially in these spaces, right? It's like um the individuals that have the power to make change, they probably don't even know how much power they have, or if they do, they abuse it. And
Yeah.
so if we walk in just as angry, right? It's like anger begets anger, and we're just going to have this clusterfuck of things that's happening where we should be like, all right, how can we get to this place where conversations, complex conversations can be had? We could be understood, right? We need to be able to watch the somatic response so that way we don't have a whole bunch of cortisol that's dumping into our bloodstream so that way cognitive dissonance takes over. But we've got to be able to adapt to certain ways on how do we have these conversations with depth and responsibility and accountability. So that's where the guiding principles of Aloha comes in, right? Asking questions, listening to deeply understand what is being said, observing your body, the somatic response that is happening in your body, always remaining heart focused and adapt and acknowledge that we all come from different places with different ideas. And, hopefully this sets the trajectory for a transformative dialogue and not the same old binary polarized ways that we've been engaging with each other.
I have to say, like, Dr. Jerry, when I look at you, I see such a badass woman too. You said that you struggle, now that I know we can swear on the here. When you said that you still struggle with that, I mean, like, I don't know of a single person who has rid themselves of it completely, right? Because we're
Mhm.
talking about generations of conditioning. So yeah, I find myself still surprised to hear you say that. And I think that something else that I started getting into the practice of doing as well when it comes to empowerment, I think that it's kind of interesting because I mentioned it before, like a lot of our love languages from immigrant families is like acts of service, right? Um,
Yes.
it's like feeding and so on and so forth. But I shifted, my ways a little bit to where like if I meet a woman and I notice something like a feature about her or a strength about her, I will tell her. Um, and it's almost like counterintuitive because it goes against how I've been raised. But for a lot, unfortunately, like for a lot of women that I've done that to, it was like their first time hearing that, you know?
Mhm. Yes, yes. And we need to be reminded. And I find myself in this place where I'm questioning when I'm amongst my own people. Isn't that strange? Oh yeah.
Anymore.
Because sometimes it's like because I'm mixed,
Uh-huh.
I'm always asked, or well, how much Hawaiian are you? How
Oh,
much of this are you? How much of that is, and all of these things. And so and people just kind of like I feel that sometimes being around my own people, you get judged heavier. Right.
yeah. No, I get that. Well, first, I have heard my Hawaiian friends say that too, like how that's just kind of a casual, normal question, like how Hawaiian are you? How much, right?
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
50? Are you 20? 25? Like, I've definitely heard
Such
that.
a colonized language.
Yeah. And what's interesting is I think with my Korean community, um, it's not a question, it's not an outright question, but they want to see how much of the language I can speak.
Mm.
And that is a real vulnerable um place for me. It's where I just don't feel Korean enough.
Mm.
Where I think that it's just so interesting because I read Crying in H Mart, and it's written by a biracial Korean white author. And while I was reading it, I was like, she's more Korean than I am because she could speak the language fluently. And I think I feel more pressure on me because I look full-blooded. So when I open my mouth, I feel like a fraud.
Mhm.
And I wasn't given an authentic Korean name. There like so many little things. And it's really interesting because growing up, I just wanted to be white. Like I remember praying to God that I would just be white. Like, why couldn't I have just have been born white? So I could fit in with my peers. So I wouldn't get grilled about these questions that I couldn't answer about my heritage or felt, made to feel like an outsider, have these like ugly eyes. So like this wide nose that I hated so much. And it's just so interesting that the older I get, the more Korean I wish I had felt.
Yes, yes, yes.
I wish I
That's
I wish I could feel more authentic. And but I think now I'm in a place where I've embraced this space between the two identities, like my American identity and my Korean identity. So that's also what kind of Korean means to me as well, is straddling the two worlds and not quite belonging to either one, but kind of like taking stake between the two and being like, this is my space, this is my place, and this space is who I am.
yes, yes, I feel you. It's so funny because you just spoke about, and you just rounded it out so beautifully on that's what it means to be kind of Korean, right? It's like trying to walk in these two worlds. And last night I was on a call and we were talking about that. I was with two other women of color and we were talking about navigating these spaces. And I shared with them a story that when I was back in Hawaii, I had a moment. I had a moment. I was sitting at the beach and everything. And I would tell my sisters, when they would go to the beach to record the ocean, and send it to me and stuff like that. So that way I could just listen to it. Right. But I was sitting there. I was at the beach and I was immersed in the water. And I was like, oh my gosh, this feels so amazing. And when I went and I spoke to one of our elders, Pokala Inui, I was telling him about my experience on how as soon as I got out of the plane, the first thing I needed to do, like everything in my body was saying, drop your stuff off at the hotel and get into the water, like everything. And I just went into the water. And for 5 out of the 7 days that I was there, I was in the ocean every single day. Even though there were beautiful pools at the resort, the pools didn't attract me. I needed to go into the ocean.
Oh,
And he said, he goes, it's because it's like coming back to the amniotic fluid of your mother. And I was like, oh my goodness. And so I'm at the beach and I'm having this moment and I'm just feeling everything. I'm in my feels. And I bring out my pen and paper and I write a poem. And I shared this last night because it's talking about both worlds and you just talked about it. So can I share it with you
oh my gosh,
and with
absolutely.
everyone else? Okay.
Yeah, I'd be so honored.
Okay. Let me see here. In the ocean breeze, I stand between two worlds in the soft breath of morning. One calls me to speak in tongues not my own, to shape myself small, to fit, to conform. But the earth beneath my feet remembers the pulse of the land. The Aina sings through my bones, a rhythm older than words, older than borders drawn in sand. What if I could walk unbound and full, carving no part of myself to fit another's mold? No code to switch, no mask to wear, just the truth of who I am, woven like kapa cloth in stories, in prayers, in the way I carry Akua, the divine, Aina, the land, and Kanaka, my people within. In this world, I am not the angry brown woman. I am the fire, the ocean. I am the wind. I am the connection that bridges hearts, the knowing glance that carries 1,000 generations. I am nurtured. My strength is nurtured in the folds of my mountains, rooted in the embrace of the land, seen not as rage, but as truth, not as defiance, but resilience.
Thank you so much for sharing that with me. Oh, Dr. Jerry, that was so beautiful.
That's the complexity of walking in these two worlds. And I think that's the root and the reason why diversity, equity, and inclusion is so important in our society. Because if it's not there, then people like you and me will be thrown off to the side, not seen, not heard, and they won't know the brilliance and the resilience that is standing in front of them, right? The fire and the wind and everything, all of the things that we have done to heal that generational trauma that we carry, so then that way we can have the forgiveness of the 3 generations back, so we don't perpetuate it 3 generations forward by healing the 7th generation, with is us, ourselves. We start with ourselves. So I can't believe that we have been on this call for as long as we have. It's been an hour and a half now. And Dr. Joan, thank you so much for sharing this time with us, and also, just bringing so much light into this world of being yourself and still having the idea of still kinda. We're kind of whole is what it is, right? We are
Yeah.
our full selves. And so how can people find you? How can they find your book? What's your contact information? And I'll also have it in the link too, but I just wanted you to share.
Yes, thank you. You can probably follow me more easily on Instagram. I have all the socials, but they're all at DrJoanSung. So it's at Dr. Joan Sung. Because my pen name, I actually honor my Korean heritage. So I actually write under Sung instead of my married last name. But you can find me there. As far as the book goes, kind of Korean stories from an American life. Honestly, everywhere where books are sold. So Amazon, bookshop.org, and you can also purchase it through Simon and Schuster as well.
Nice.
And for Seattleites, Third Place Books website is a great place if you want to support local, which I think is always the better way to go.
Exactly. And I know with bookshop.org is like they donate a certain percentage towards the local bookstores as well too. So I love bookshop and Third Place Books. So yes, that is amazing. And I will put all of Dr. Jones' information in the link so that way you could find her and possibly talk story with her a little bit deeper about all of the things that we spoke about. And so thank you, everyone. You have been listening to the Evolution of Aloha podcast of Plowline Media Production. Tune in for upcoming episodes with other amazing people. And don't forget to subscribe to the Evolution of Aloha and the Plowline podcast, available on all your popular podcast platforms. And to help continue this work, please consider becoming a supporter and head over to patreon.com/Plowline Productions. Your contributions will go directly toward producing and building more engaging content. So until next time, please take care of yourselves and each other. And aloha, everyone, and mahalo, Dr. Joan, for meeting with us.